Okay, today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to read a book. This is Mummies. It is a pretty cool book, Mummies Made in Egypt. Now, as I was putting this lesson together on mummies, I realized that you guys don't always see what I see. And so I just want to give you the guys the book because this is it's a great book. It covers everything you need to know about mummification. Reading Rainbow, right there. That is a TV show that was on PBS in the mid 80s, all the way through about 10 years ago. So it covered books. Kids would review these books and push on. We would read this in class. This is one of the class sets that we have. But since you're not here, we'll cover it here on the web. We have these gods. That was one of the first things I want to show you is those gods. We have Thoth. He's ibis-headed god of scribes. And there he is showing writing on papyrus. We have Horus, god of the sky and son of Osiris. We have Ujat, magic eye and protector of Horus and protector of the dead. We have Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the embalmers. Geb, the god of earth. Hathor, goddess of the city of Dendera. Isis, wife of Osiris and mother of Horus. Nephthys, sister of Isis. Tefnet, goddess of moisture. Shu, god of air. And Re, Horakti, Horus of the two horizons. Now, one thing you'll notice, you'll see these little hieroglyphic inscriptions up there. I believe those will be their names, although the names are usually in a cartouche, and we'll see a cartouche later on, I think. Now, Osiris, he is the prince of the dead and god of the underworld. Unlike Christianity, the underworld is not hell. Okay, that's not something that they believe in. It is another realm, and so the Greeks have it. The underworld is just a place where the dead are sent. Okay, the ancient Egyptians had one great wish. The wish was to live forever. Egyptians believed that after they died, a new life began. They would live in their tombs as they lived on earth. They would also travel to another world to live with God and goddess of the dead. Another thing is, in our modern society, we do not have as much contact with our dead as the Egyptians did, or the people in most times throughout history. Most of the times in history, we would have, if you had a family member who died, you would be there. You'd be close to them. You'd see what would happen to them. Okay. But nowadays, our rituals surrounding death, they're further removed. And so death is not as present as it had been 50 to 100 years ago. Most of our people, when they die in the hospital. Okay, and so we're not present when people die as much. Egyptians believed that everyone had a Ba, or soul, and a Ka, an invisible twin of the person. The Ba is represented as a bird with a human head. The dead person is his Ka. They believed that when a person died, his Ba and Ka were released from the body and lived in the tomb. The Ba would keep contact with the living family of friends of the dead and friends of the dead. The Ka traveled back and forth from the body to the other world. In order for the person to live forever, the Ba and Ka had to recognize the body, or they could not return to it. That is why the body had to be preserved or mummified. Okay, the Ba is shown in that picture, returning to the mummy at night. It was believed that the dead traveled to the other world in a boat. That's another similarity with Greek mythology, crossing over that river of death. The river, I think it's called Styx in the underworld. In Gilgamesh, they talked about those waters of death that they would cross. Water is frequently seen as a veil between the living and the dead. When we were looking at Halloween a little bit, we talked about how that veil that separated us from the living dead was something that was thin over that Halloween season. And so that's why Europeans would dress up so they would not be taken into the underworld. Okay, now the corpse was buried in a crouching position. Jars of food were buried with it for use in the new life. A mummy is a corpse that has been dried out so it will not decay. The earliest Egyptians were mummified naturally. The corpse was buried in the ground. The hot, dry sand of Egypt dried out the body and preserved the body. Well, the preserved body turned as hard as stone into a fossil. As a as time went on, burials became more elaborate. The dead were wrapped in a shroud of cloth or skin. They were buried in pits lined with wood or stone, or in caves. The bodies not buried directly in the sand became exposed to dampness, air, and bacteria. They decayed. So people learned how to embalm or mummify their dead. It took centuries of practice to perfect the art. Embalmers became so expert that mummies they made remained preserved for thousands of years. Okay, here are some bodies were laid prone before being wrapped. Today, scientists use X-ray machines to study mummies through their wrappings. Mummification was a long, complicated, and expensive process. People were mummified and buried according to what they could afford. The poor had modest burials. Noblemen and others who served the king and his queen had elaborate burials. Pharaohs, the kings of Egypt, were the richest of all. It was believed, too, that the pharaoh became a god when he died. So pharaohs were mummified, the best, and buried in splendor. Okay, Egyptians embalmed animals, and that's one thing we talked about. They mummified them as the way they did people and buried them as sacrifices to the gods or goddesses. The mummy of a cat with its face painted on its wrappings.
Good morning. Will you all please rise?
Okay. The mummy of a falcon, and inside its coffin, the mummy of a crocodile with eyes sewn on to linen wrappings. Uh, I think we talked about how they found that graveyard of about 80,000 animals. Okay, it took 70 days for embalmers to prepare a body. For royal or noble burial, embalmers worked in workshops near the tomb where mummies would be buried. Priests held ceremonies for each step of the mummification process. Assistants brought supplies to the embalmers. Embalmers first took out the inner organs. They removed the brain through the nostrils with metal hooks. They made a slit in the left side of the body and took out the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. Each of these organs was embalmed in a chemical natron and put in its own container called a canopic jar. The heart was left in its place. In later times, the heart was also removed and embalmed, and a stone scarab was put in its place. Small bundles of natron wrapped in linen were stuffed inside the body. The outside was covered with natron too. The chemical dried the body the same way the sand had done. Okay, the corpse brain was removed. Oh, I didn't change the page. The corpse brain was removed and probably thrown away. They didn't think the brain was very much. The inner organs were removed. The body cavity was stuffed with bundles of natron. The corpse was placed on a slanted embalming bed. And there he is right there. That over a little bit. With a groove at the bottom. It was covered with natron, a grainy chemical found in deposits in the Nile River. Fluids from the corpse dripped into the container as the body dried out. The canopic jars and the gods that guarded them. Hapi, the lungs. Dwamutef, the stomach. Imseti, the liver. And Kebehenuef was the intestines. The internal organs were mummified separately from the body. Each organ was wrapped in linen and covered with a mask of the god that protected it. Then each mummified organ was put into its own canopic jar. The lid of the jar was also bore the image of the god. The embalming cut was covered with a plate bearing the protective eye of Horus. So there you see it down in the lower left next to the belly button. After 40 days, the natron packs were removed. The dried, shrunken body was sponge cleaned and brushed with oils, ointments, spices, and resin. The head of the body was stuffed with new packing soaked in the same substance. The eye sockets were plugged with linen and closed. The nostrils were stuffed with beeswax. The arms were crossed, and the mummy's fingernails and toenails were covered with caps of gold. The embalming cut was sewn together. The mummy was adorned with jewels of gold and precious stones. Then the body was carefully bound with long, narrow strips of linen. Fingers, toes, arms, and legs were wrapped individually. Linen shrouds were placed between the layers, binding. Every few layers were glued together with resin. After 20 layers of shrouds, the binding of the mummy's body took on its normal size. It was possible during the long process that a piece of the corpse, an ear or a toe, would fall off. Kind of weird. This and all leftover material was used in the embalming, were saved in jars to be buried near the tomb. A layer of binding was covered with the shroud. Another layer of binding was placed over that. Then another shroud, and so on, for 20 layers. The person's name was written on the binding. Now this is really cool. Up at the top of that page, we have the scarab, the symbol of renewed life. We have Ujat, the protective eye of Horus, the lotus, symbol of rebirth, the headdress for mummy's comfort, Jed column, symbol of Osiris's backbone, the Uas scepter, symbol of well-being, the knot of Isis, symbol of fertility, Ankh, the sign of life. And that's probably what you're most familiar with, is that Ankh, that cross with the circle at the top. A writing board for the mummy to use, steps leading to the throne of Osiris, 2 arms symbolizing the Ka, Shen symbolizing infinity. Now, the Shabti, that would be a little figurine that they'd put in the tomb. They're probably about a foot tall. But these would be servants for the dead, that they would do to carry out the work for the dead. Some of the many amulets found on the mummies, sometimes hundreds of Shabtis, were buried with the mummy. The pharaoh would have a lot of Shabtis with them. Magic amulets were tucked in between the mummy's wrappings, and the small mummy-shaped figures called Shabtis held farm tools. The Shabtis would work the fields in the other world for the mummy. The bound head was covered with a portrait mask. If anything had happened to the mummy, the Ba and Ka would still be able to recognize it. The mask, too, was bound. Then the whole package was wrapped in a shroud, and given the last coat of resin, the mummy was finished. What's really cool is in later times, especially during the Greek period, the Ptolemy period, you'll have a lot of these burial masks painted onto their sarcophaguses. Many portrait masks were painted on cartonnage, a material made of linen and plaster. They were molded and painted. Sometimes the masks were made of gold and inlaid with precious stones. Often they bore the plaited beard of Osiris. A collection of spells called the Book of the Dead was buried with the mummy. The spells, written and illustrated on scrolls and papyrus, were to help the dead find everlasting life. One of my students brought in a copy of the Book of the Dead. I have it in one of my folders. Let's find it for you. For a period of time, the mummies were buried on their sides so that they could look out of the eyes painted on the wooden coffin. Later, mummies were buried in mummy-shaped coffins made of wood or plaster and painted. Meanwhile, artists and sculptors and carpenters prepared the burial. They made the coffin or nests of coffins for a mummy. The coffins were painted inside and out with the gods and goddesses and magic spells of protection. Carpenters prepared the mummiform coffin. A nest of mummiform coffins. The mummy was put into an inner coffin. The inner coffin was covered and placed inside a second covered coffin, which fitted inside an outer coffin. The outer coffin was covered. Eventually, these coffins would be placed in a stone coffin called a sarcophagus. Magic spells were painted on the coffins in hieroglyphs, the pictures, writing used by the ancient Egyptians. The way people bury their dead also varies with culture. And so burying people on their side is what the ancient Egyptians started off with, but then they turned them so they faced up. It is fascinating to look at the burial rites or burial customs of different cultures and see how they did it. Because Egyptians, like the Norse, would put grave goods with their people. Native Americans would do this too, where a Native American would take personal items with them onto their grave. Um, Not all cultures believe in grave goods, though, or what position the body should be in when you buried them. They made jewelry for the mummy and furniture that would be buried in the tomb. To carve statues of the dead person to be placed on the tomb, these would serve as a resting place for the Ba and Ka, should anything happen to the mummy. A splendid stone sarcophagus, you guys need to remind me to change this, was made to hold the coffin. The walls of the royal tombs were carved and painted with scenes that would magically come alive. The scenes show the person's new life in the other world. Dancers, musicians entertained them. Servants worked the fields and carried food for him to eat. The gods and goddesses of the dead would welcome him. A long, solemn funeral procession took the mummy to the tomb. The mummy rested on an elaborate sled pulled by oxen. Another sled carried the canopy of jars in its chest. Priests, family servants, and mourners who were paid to weep followed. The porters carried the many possessions that would be buried with the mummy. It's fascinating that they have paid mourners. They thought that was important, I guess. A tomb was no longer just a pit. It was a house for a mummy, the Ba and the Ka, that was made to last forever. The royal tomb was a fortress against robbers who had tried to steal the mummies and their treasures. Tombs were more important than houses to Egyptians. People had them built during their lifetime. For centuries, the dead were usually buried in tombs called mastabas. Mastabas were made of brick and stone. Royal mastabas had many storage chambers and were beautifully carved and decorated. Okay, here's a mastaba with a shaft, a false door, and the shaft leads down to the burial chamber. The mastaba, the mummy was lowered down the shaft and into the burial chamber. It was thought that the Ba used this shaft to return to the mummy at night. Each tomb had a false door through which the Ka could come and go. As years went by, the pharaohs took more and more with them into the tomb. Tombs became bigger and stronger and more elaborate. For a long time, pharaohs and pyramids built for themselves. Pyramids were huge monuments that took hundreds of workers in their lifetime to build. Groups of workers cut and dragged huge blocks of stone up mud ramps starting at each corner of the pyramid. As the pyramid grew, another ramp was added. It took 2 million blocks to build the Great Pyramid. And we talked about that theory about the mud ramps. Again, I doubt that they would have mud ramps, especially on the exterior. Now, I do think that they could use the interior, kind of a spiral system to get up to the top. And then the last few stones would be differently placed or hauled up to the top. Tombs were built in the desert where the land could not be farmed. Sometimes the mourners brought the mummy by boat up the Nile. The boat that carried the mummy was buried near the tomb for the mummy's use in the new life. The pyramid covered the pharaoh's burial chamber. Near it were temples, storage chambers, and mastabas, where the royal family and servants would be buried. Later, pharaohs were buried in secret underground tombs in a deserted place that is known as the Valley of the Kings. Tunnels, passages, chambers, and the tomb itself were cut deep into the rock, hidden from sight. They were magnificently carved and painted. This is the Valley of the Kings, where King Tut's tomb was found, and it's fascinating because there's dozens of these tombs cut into the valley, and they all have different shaped tunnels. I believe most of the tunnels avoided each other. I don't know if they ever intersected. If they did intersect, would have been a mistake, I believe. A priest dressed as a god, Anubis, held the mummy up for the ceremony. The sarcophagus was closed. The mourners left the tomb for a funeral banquet, and the leftover food was buried near the tomb. Thereafter, priests and family worshipped at the temple and brought food offerings to the mummy's Ka. Women wept and threw dust on their heads. Now, going back to the little sarcophagus, oftentimes they'd put the sarcophagus in the tomb before the tomb was built because it was too big to move through the small passages. Okay, when the funeral procession came to rest in the tomb, priests performed the final ritual on the mummy called the opening of the mouth. The mummy's mouth was not actually open, but magically given the ability to speak and eat again. The mummy was put in a sarcophagus, which was covered with a heavy stone lid. The canopic chest with the jars guarded by their own gods stood nearby. The mourners left the entrance, and the entrance of the tomb was sealed up with a wall of stone slabs. At last the mummy was in its eternal resting place and on its way to its new life. So, I had that picture twice. We don't need that one. Now, what's really good, you can still buy this book if you want it. It's pretty cool. There's a link to buy it on Amazon. And then Reading Rainbow, I put that little link on there too. Like I said, funerals and how we treat the dead is pretty fascinating. It does show a lot of our culture. It shows our religions. It shows our wealth at times. It shows where our values are. And so looking at how the Egyptians took care of their dead is pretty fascinating. If you guys have any questions, shoot me an email. Have a good day.